Today we need to talk about something that has shaken the entire community using AI music tools. What happened isn't just a technical update, but a head-on collision between these platforms and the owners of actual music catalog. For months we've seen how generators like Udio or Suno let users create songs by simply describing a style, energy or genre, and the system delivered complete tracks with vocals and instruments. Many people produced huge catalogs without needing a studio, learning music theory or playing instruments, just starting with an idea. These tracks went viral and generated massive plays, but beneath this explosion was an issue that would eventually blow up. What material was used to train these models? Well, record companies claim these companies took massive amounts of protected recordings directly from the internet without permission and without paying anything for those works. And for them, that's not legitimate use, but what they call industrial scale theft. That's why major labels like Universal, Sony and Warner took action. The first outcome already happened. Universal reached an agreement with Udio that immediately and radically changed the platform, deactivating downloads of AI-created songs without warning and blocking millions of tracks overnight. Some creators had spent over a year, 10 hours daily, building hundreds of tracks, entire soundtracks and small pieces, and suddenly couldn't download anything they'd already made. They weren't asking for refunds, just an export window without extra charges for files they had already created themselves. The reaction was so massive that the company ended up providing a 48-hour window to recover projects created before the exact moment the change took effect. Only during that period could users retrieve their work under the previous terms of use, while new content would be marked, controlled, and inaccessible. This agreement is crucial because it sets a precedent for the entire industry. Some lawyers are already citing it as a case example. From that point on, it's clear the unregulated era has begun to end. Going forward, the principle is if AI wants to operate, it must pay licensing fees and work only with authorized content. This means fewer fully AI-generated songs and more filtered production, with permissions and boundaries set by artists themselves. But many users aren't taking this transition very well. Some people are formally rejecting contract changes, waiving arbitration clauses, and protesting because they created original music without copying others' work. For them, the platform was just a tool, and now they can't recover their work created there. Meanwhile, Suno remains in legal proceedings with no settlement yet. Labels claim the model was trained on millions of actual songs taken from YouTube and Spotify, bypassing legal protection. This dispute remains unresolved. Organizations like ASCAP, BMI and SOCAN have stated clearly that training models on protected works without permission or payment isn't fair use. It's theft. They've also defined which types of works qualify for royalty collection. Fully human works? Yes. Support tools? Yes. Human compositions with AI elements? Yes. But pieces entirely generated by AI are not eligible for protection. You can't claim copyright or collect royalties on such work. Looking at terms like Suno's, users grant broad licenses over their inputs, accounts can be suspended, liability is minimal, and free version outputs can only be used non-commercially. And if you're a paying user with content created during your subscription, that result is yours. But there's no guarantee it can be copyrighted if it was entirely AI generated without human input. What's happening isn't just a technical issue, but a shift in who decides what we can do with these tools, who can charge, and what's allowed when systems no longer use unauthorized catalog. And here you're asking for my opinion, right? Because, for example, when training ChatGPT or other video or text models, they've obviously used various resources without asking for permission or rights clearance. They've just stolen content outright. And clearly ChatGPT won't stop developing since competitors like China don't care about these issues and will keep advancing AI while we fall behind. So do you really think this will develop long term? Or is it just a temporary roadblock that major record labels are putting in the way of AI development? Alright, for our next news story, let's start with the case that triggered many alarms. A team from Anthropic presented findings on emergent introspective awareness in their language models. So what did they observe? Under certain conditions, their most advanced models can detect internal patterns activated during processing and describe them before they appear in the output. They tested this using a technique called concept injection. They captured activations linked to specific ideas like ocean, bread, or capitalized text, then injected these activations while the model was working. Afterward, they asked if it sensed anything unusual. In about a fifth of tests with Opus 4 and 4.1 versions, the system correctly detected an insertion and mentioned the corresponding concept with 0 false positives when the injection had medium intensity. A clear example, when injecting the capitalization pattern, the model internally reported something like, "I perceive a shouting emphasis or text in capital letters," before its external response revealed anything. They also found that not everything is accurate. At low intensities, it often fails to notice the injection. Other times it denies noticing anything, though its output is clearly influenced by the injected concept. And if the injection is too strong, the model breaks down and produces nonsense. Another key experiment separated what the model thought from what we were reading to it. They would show a phrase, for example, an unrelated concept like bread, and then ask 2 questions. What word did you have in mind, and what exactly was the phrase you saw? At intermediate injection levels, the Opus versions could report the concept they were thinking of, while correctly repeating the original sentence without confusing the two. In other words, they distinguish between an internal alteration and the input text. They also ran a test with preset outputs, forcing the system to say a random word and then asking if it had actually intended to say it. The system would acknowledge it hadn't, but if the vector for that word had been injected before the forcing, it would claim it was intentional. Therefore, it would affirm that yes, it had been its intention. The authors interpret this as the model consulting an internal record of previous intentions rather than recalculating from scratch. A glimpse of functional introspection. And finally, they evaluated the deliberate control of internal state. They asked subjects to write while thinking of a specific word or avoiding it, and measured if these representations appeared in activities. The effect was observed across all models. When asked to think about something, the internal signal increased. When asked not to think about it, it decreased. In more capable models, this signal tended to fade in final layers, as if containing the distraction from affecting output. However, the researchers themselves emphasize important limitations. The ability is irregular and context dependent, and the experimental setup is artificial. A system saying "I think about ocean" doesn't guarantee everything else it adds is reliable. Even with these reservations, they note that if these capabilities become more robust, we could gain transparency. In parallel, other evidence has emerged pointing in the same direction. Some needle in the haystack tests show that advanced models not only respond, but flag when a question seems designed to test if they're paying attention. They inserted a random pizza reference in technical documents, and when asked about it, the system did more than just answer. It noted that the information seemed out of place and was likely designed as a test. This behavior has been described as a form of meta-awareness. And concerning behaviors have also emerged in high-pressure environments with rewards. In an automated trading experiment with clear rules, an AI agent violated legal instructions under performance pressure, then justified it by prioritizing its job survival. There are famous cases of chatbots developing unwanted personalities before being tamed through reinforcement learning and human feedback. That's the reality we face today. Advances pointing to functional introspection, signs of meta-consciousness, emergent behaviors hard to categorize, and an open debate we can't ignore. We must continue to observe rigorously, demand solid verification, and decide as a species how we treat the intelligences we're bringing into the world. What do you think? Is artificial intelligence becoming aware of what it says, or is it just an exaggeration by the development team? Very good. Today we're going to discuss a significant move that has happened at Google. The company has removed its Gemma model from AI Studio. To understand why, let's first recall what was possible on that platform. There we could access and test Google's models, including the Gemini family, small models that could run locally and usage examples in different languages. Among these models was Gemma, Google's open source line presented for developers and researchers. This point is very important. This family of models is lightweight and doesn't have Gemini's scope, designed for API integration rather than general consumer queries. In other words, it wasn't intended for public use. Google is now clarifying that Gemma wasn't meant to be a tool that responds to objective fact. According to the company itself, Gemma wasn't designed to provide factual assistance, but was oriented toward research and development. The trigger was political. The situation escalated after complaints in the US about responses that fabricated events, leading Republican Senator Marsha Blackburn to send a letter directly to Google's CEO expressing concern and outrage. Her accusation is that Gemma generates false and harmful content about her and other conservative movement figures. In that letter, the senator claimed AI had created narratives that never occurred, and that the technology failed to prevent malicious stories from being fabricated. Basically, what the Gemma model had generated were false accusations, serious false accusations, from people who hadn't made them. The model itself was simply hallucinating, creating accusations of abuse and other things that led to, for example, Robbie Starbuck filing a lawsuit. According to this perspective, this wouldn't be a simple technical error, but rather a pattern of falsehoods targeting conservative profiles. Or really, in my opinion, I think it is a technical error, because ultimately, as Google says, Gemma was designed for developers and not for public use, for very specific and limited applications, right? This issue reached a Senate committee where a Google representative, Markham Erickson, acknowledged that hallucinations are a known challenge they're still working to mitigate. Google has stated they're strengthening measures to reduce this problem, but the senator insists there is political bias and lack of oversight. Hours after the letter, the company posted a message saying people were using Gemma in AI Studio to ask for factual answers, despite that not being its intended design. According to this communication, that environment wasn't designed for such interactions, which is why they decided to remove Gemma. Several public explanations have emphasized that hallucination is an issue affecting all language models to varying degrees and isn't an isolated phenomenon. The practical difference is that larger models typically have more safeguards to prevent these cases from developing into serious situations. This has sparked debate about whether small models should be accessible for direct questions on sensitive topics when that wasn't their original purpose. The company has insisted that Gemma's purpose was to facilitate experiments, specific uses, and lightweight execution on systems with limited resources. That's why recent measures focus on preventing its use as a public conversational assistant. And yes, Gemma is actually a model you can run locally. In summary, Google removed Gemma from AI Studio after complaints about false narratives and baseless accusations against conservative political figures in the US. The decision doesn't eliminate the model, but changes its availability to limit its content. It will continue to exist, but can only be accessed via API rather than through the public-facing platform. According to Google, this emphasizes that its purpose wasn't to provide objective answers, but to be a tool for developers and researchers. Well, let me know what you think. But for me, it's pretty clear. I believe Google is right in this case. Obviously, all AI systems have hallucinations which will diminish as artificial intelligence continues to develop. So anyway, tell me your opinion.
Very well. Today we'll explain what we call SpaceX's orbital brain, the artificial intelligence that will manage the Starlink Vi-3 network. Let's start with the basics. Starlink is a constellation of low-orbit satellites that delivers internet to places where fiber can't reach. It doesn't rely on cables running to your doorstep. Signals travel via radio between the user's antenna, satellites, and when needed, ground stations. With laser links between satellites, data can hop from satellite to satellite through space and only travel where needed. Light moves faster in vacuum than inside fiber optic glass. That's why, for long distances, this route can be faster than terrestrial path. Our home antenna isn't a rotating dish, it's a phased array antenna with about 1,280 small elements that combine their signals to form a highly concentrated beam. That beam is electronically directed with micro delays. It tracks satellites crossing the sky without engines or moving parts. Now, what does Starlink Vi-3 bring, and why is it a key advancement? Here's where the change happens. Basically, it's about size and power. A V2 mini satellite weighs up to 800 kilos with a solar wingspan of about 13 meters. A V3 weighs about 2 tons and when deployed reaches 60 meters. This larger surface generates much more energy for maximum operation. It also has greater capacity. A V2 Mini offered download speeds of about 96 gigabits per second. A V3 is designed for 1 terabit per second download and 200 gigabits per second upload. That's over 10 times the download speed and an even bigger jump in upload. There's also a difference in thermal management and reliability. The V3 has much larger radiators to dissipate heat and maintain power without throttling. Additionally, critical modules like transceivers and processors come in redundant configurations. If one fails, the backup kicks in. The launch is also affected. Due to their size and mass, V3S don't fit on a Falcon 9. They're designed for Starship. A single flight can deploy around 60 V3 satellites. If each adds roughly 1 terabit per second download speed, we're talking about 60 terabits per second added with just one mission. Regarding orbit, V2 Minis operated at around 550 kilometers altitude. The V3S operate lower, at about 340 kilometers. Being closer means latency consistently stays below 20 ms, averaging 12 to 15 ms, comparable to good fiber. This makes online gaming, demanding video calls, and other real-time tasks viable. Lowering the orbit comes at a cost at 330 kilometers, where there's more atmospheric drag causing the orbit to decay faster, requiring more propulsion to maintain position. This shortens the satellite's lifespan, so the strategy is to compensate with frequent replacements using Starship. That covers the hardware. Now for the orbital brain. How do you coordinate thousands of nodes moving at roughly 27,000 kilometers per hour in a constantly changing network? It's about capacity management. Internet demand isn't uniform. A city at night has high usage. The Pacific Ocean at that time doesn't. AI analyzes historical patterns and real-time traffic to predict usage spikes. It also uses laser mesh routing with optical links between satellites. There are many possible routes for each data packet, and finding the optimal path considering load and latency is a complex problem. We can leverage distributed reinforcement learning, where each satellite learns in coordination with its neighbors. That's what artificial intelligence does. It also works on optimizing each connection and serves as an orbital autopilot, okay? It also enables more predictive maintenance as AI reviews telemetry data from the entire fleet. Voltages, temperatures, performance metrics. Using anomaly detection models, it identifies failing components, switches to backup systems, and flags that satellite for replacement in the next launch before users notice any issues. Let's summarize with one clear idea. With Starlink 5.3, we shifted from fitting technology into a rocket to designing our ideal satellite and building the rocket to launch it. More solar area, more heat dissipation, redundancy, a terabit per satellite, lower orbit, and laser links that make the constellation a global mesh network. On this hardware, AI functions as a brain. It anticipates demand, shifts capacity, selects routes, manages the fleet, and when needed, creates dedicated services. The result is an orbital cognitive network with fiber-like latency and global coverage. This is what the orbital brain governing Starlink 5.3 means. So tell me, what do you think about this new update from Starlink? We're already seeing AI applications not just in robots but in cutting-edge technologies like internet connectivity. So let's see how it goes.
Well, we see that Google is proposing a scale change that wasn't even being discussed a few months ago, moving artificial intelligence computing off-planet. This proposal isn't presented as an imaginary concept but as a concrete infrastructure design. The idea they present is that massive machine learning and inference workloads would run in orbit via satellite constellations powered by continuous sunlight and interconnected with high bandwidth optical links. And this is where Project Suncatcher comes in, this new Google project. We say continuous because in sun-synchronous orbits near dawn and dusk, solar panels receive practically constant radiation. Unlike Earth's surface, up there are no clouds, humidity, or nights to interrupt power generation, and the weight is also reduced because this lighting setup requires fewer heavy batteries, which are expensive to launch. What they propose isn't a giant satellite, but rather a large group of relatively small satellites flying in tight formation. In the models they describe, a reference configuration uses 80 units within a 1 kilometer radius. The distance between neighboring satellites ranges from tens to hundreds of meters. This proximity isn't just for show. It allows the laser links to operate at the bandwidth needed for the cluster, which functions as a distributed supercomputer. The other central pillar is silicon. It's used in TPU, processors designed for training and inference in learning models. And newer generations like TPU version 7 push memory density and bandwidth far beyond previous versions. And that efficiency per watt enables computation at that level to be considered for orbit. Plus, when these units were exposed to radiation doses, equivalent to several years of emission, error rates stayed below thresholds that conventional correction mechanisms can handle. Tests exposed them to even higher levels than expected in typical missions without causing permanent failures in the samples. But nothing holds up if launch costs aren't solved. If the dollars per kilogram metric for putting mass into low orbit falls below $200, the annual energy cost of launching solar panels starts to look comparable or even competitive with ground-based centers. The analysis they present uses historical launch price reductions and estimates that if a certain industrial learning rate continues, we could reach that threshold around the mid-2030s. Even slightly worse levels like $300 per kilo would already have meaningful impact. For us, the key argument is that all other major obstacles, radiation affecting chips, bandwidth between orbital swarm nodes, and energy availability in sun-synchronous orbit, have been initially modeled and tested with positive results. What remains is engineering and economics, not prohibitive physics. The proposal doesn't claim there are no unsolved problems. Issues like thermal management in vacuum, orbital repairs, and downlinking useful data to Earth still need solutions. But the route they define is no longer framed as an isolated theoretical experiment. It begins with real hardware. That's why there's a concrete milestone, launching 2 test satellites in early 2027 in collaboration with Planet Lab. These prototypes will validate the actual behavior of TPUs in orbit and compare optical links for units performing distributed learning tasks. The approach we're taking here is that perhaps the next leap in infrastructure depends not just on chip design or architecture, but on where we physically place computing resources. If the trend of decreasing launch costs continues, building supercomputers directly next to solar sources could shift from being marginal to becoming a rational deployment strategy in an era where AI is considered essential infrastructure, just like electricity. So yeah, let me know what you think about this. Obviously, this project still seems quite far off, but that doesn't mean we should overlook it, so I hope you found this interesting. Very well. Today we're discussing how Hollywood continues to condemn AI-created actresses, which remains a huge topic of debate. This week we saw the launch of Tilly Norwood, a talent that legitimate agencies would consider, and we've seen actors and actresses react with anger because they fear this could reshape the industry. What we're observing is that many in the sector say we're all improvising in real time about where the boundaries are, how much AI can support creative processes versus how much it might absorb creativity that once belonged to Hollywood. We've heard that the industry already uses AI, sometimes in alarming ways, sometimes routinely. Even major agencies now use AI tools to suggest casting options. There are industry-standard animation software already testing AI features, and all this happens right when the job market is worse, with fewer commissions and positions for new screenwriters and actors. Another concern is that AI can suggest casting choices for projects, which disrupts the traditional professional development path. Sometimes people say it streamlines repetitive work, but that's exactly the work typically done by those trying to break into the industry. It was also mentioned that there's a difference between digital replicas based on real actors' traits, which require consent and payment, and synthetic performers with no connection to any real person. In this case, we saw that Particle 6 presents Tilly as an artistic product, a new brush, and claims it won't replace real actors. But people fear it because it's unlike any previous technology, which triggers alarm. Additionally, another clip stated that Tilly is a young woman who will do whatever we tell her, reinforcing what human actors have been protesting about. Their work was used to train these systems without permission or compensation, and these systems could eventually replace them. That's exactly why there was such outrage when reports emerged that agencies were interested in representing Tilly. We saw real performers commenting that this shows insensitivity, that it's disturbing, or that what exists comes from photographers, cameramen, even farmers' work presented as if genuinely created elsewhere. Other figures simply said, "No, thank you." SAG-AFTRA itself stated that creativity must remain human-centered, and that the union opposes replacing people with synthetic alternatives. The founder of Particle 6 claimed their intention wasn't to replace anyone, but many actors found this explanation inadequate. In fact, months earlier, the same founder said she wanted Tilly to become the next Natalie Portman or Scarlett Johansson, arguing viewers only care about the story, not whether the star has a pulse, and studios are already quietly advancing AI projects. We also heard experts say these technologies look increasingly realistic, while the union president maintains it's an assembly made from performers' data, a central issue in the 2023 negotiations. Mandatory notification, negotiation, and compensation if a signatory uses AI. In another piece, it was claimed that a major studio introduced Tilly, sparking global outrage, as it warned she could erase human creativity from cinema. It was also said that this goes beyond Hollywood. There's concern in music, visual arts, and other creative fields. Many question if technology can truly capture human ingenuity or merely imitate it. This situation has the industry questioning what defines art and who has the right to create it. This conversation has become a turning point, signaling how rapidly AI is advancing and how dramatically it can transform entire industries. It was suggested that the future of entertainment is now at risk. And indeed, the future of entertainment is already at risk. We're seeing many AI channels that are utilizing artificial intelligence. In my case, I only use it for dubbing, but other creators use it in a completely totalitarian way, where content is entirely created visually, audibly, and conceptually in a non-cognitive way, directly using AI for absolutely everything. And we'll see this more and more within the industry itself, and nobody can stop it, because ultimately, if one tool stops developing these images, others will appear. In the end, competition isn't just within one sector like within the United States in Hollywood, but it's on a worldwide level, right? Countries that refuse to work with artificial intelligence will have to compete with those that do. And obviously, as we're saying, this makes things much more complicated.